Well, good evening. My name is Elise Adler, and on behalf of Kent Oliver, our library director, and the library staff, I just want to say thank you for coming tonight to the Nashville Reads finale with Dr. Christine Darden. Nashville Reads is a way of bringing the entire city together to read great literature, to broaden literary horizons, and to create forums for discussion. And this year, the New York Times nonfiction bestseller, Hidden Figures, The American Dream, and the Untold Story of the Black Women Mathematicians Who Helped Win the Space Race by Margot Lee Shetterly was selected as the citywide read. It has been read and discussed at over 100 programs in 30 different locations, with hundreds of copies being distributed around the city. The book inspires messages of perseverance and equity, equality, hard work, as well as patriotism and heroism. It profiles women of color who overcame discrimination and racial segregation to become American achievers in mathematics, scientific, and engineering history. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but just allow me. So Dr. Christine Darden is one such distinguished aerospace engineer and mathematician. She's considered an international expert in the areas of sonic boom prediction, sonic boom minimization, and supersonic wing design. She's been recognized with dozens of awards and honors, too many to name here, but include recognition for her active involvement in working with and encouraging young people to pursue careers in math and science. So tonight you can all fasten your seatbelts as we hear from her and learn more about her life and her amazing career. Does somebody want to clap for that? You can clap for that, absolutely. I want to thank all of you and the thousands of Nashvillians who participated in this year's Nashville Reads initiative, who used your library cards, yay, and participated in book clubs and movie screenings and so many different events, again, around the city. I want to thank all of our partners. Along with the Nashville Public Library, we have Lipscomb University, Parnassus Books, Humanities Tennessee, BookPage, and the Mayor's Office. I also want to thank Advanced Financial Services Foundation for sponsoring this year's read. I also want to take a special moment, to thank Lipscomb University, who has been an incredible community partner and has been instrumental in making this year's read particularly special for the community. Megan Davis, I don't know where you are, but thank you. And Dean David Elrod, who you'll hear in a minute, I want to say thank you to the Peugeot family who made Dr. Darden's visit possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So now I'd like to bring to the podium the Dean and Professor of College of Engineering, David Elrod. Dean Elrod brings 39 years of engineering and leadership experience from the aerospace and defense industry to the Raymond B. Jones College of Engineering at Lipscomb University. He served as Vice President of Jacobs Technology and General Manager of Aerospace Testing Alliance, a joint venture that operated and maintained the world's largest collection of aerospace ground test facilities for the United States Air Force. Please join me in welcoming Dean David Elrod.
Good evening. On behalf of Lipscomb University and the Raymond B. Jones College of Engineering, the Peugeot Center for Engineering Service and Developing Communities, I just want to welcome you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your interest in Dr. Darden's story. She did a great job today in working with our students to helping to share how through her life she broke through many barriers not just technically, dealing with supersonic flight and complex problems like how to minimize sonic booms, but culturally and socially, and finding new ways to advance and explore in the fields of science that she became a preeminent researcher in. We just appreciate her work, appreciate the Peugeots and their generosity in enabling this event and her visit to Lipscomb and her visit here tonight. I just hope that you, like each of us have through the day, learn the power of persistence and the power of asking questions, the power of just moving ahead with your life in a way that goes beyond the constraints that we normally face. She demonstrated it and exemplified it, and it's our privilege to be part of this tonight. Let me welcome Mr. Kent Oliver, the director of the Nashville Public Library here.
Well, good evening, everyone. And I want to welcome you here this evening, and I'd certainly like to welcome any representatives we have of the Board of Directors of the Nashville Public Library and the Board of Directors of our foundation. We're so happy to have those folks here along with you. But most of all, I do want to make sure that we welcome you folks and our partners and sponsors in this who've made this year's Nashville Reads a huge success. And if you've looked at the programming online, you will see that we've been all over the city, and we've had a lot of great people helping us get the word out. Nashville Reads is the cornerstone of our library. And if you think about our library's mission and values, it certainly makes sense that it would be. Here at the library, we obviously care deeply about reading, books, and stories. Great stories and great conversations are meant to bring us all together. That's why the library and its partners invest in Nashville Reads. It brings us together over literature. Honestly, for those of us that work here at the library and are librarians, it couldn't be much better than to go through the process and enjoy a Nashville Reads season. This year's Nashville Reads selection, Hidden Figures, is a nonfiction work that has taught us about the brilliance and bravery of 4 female African-American scientists who helped our nation soar into space. This certainly has special significance here at NPL because of the investments we've made in teaching people about the dramatic moments that occurred right here in Nashville during the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s. And certainly if you go one floor up above us, you can see what I'm talking about when you visit our civil rights room. To celebrate what we've learned together these past months through Nashville Reads 2019, we're honoring Dr. Darden, a scientist whose work built on the pioneers in Hidden Figures. At this time, I'm very pleased, and it is my pleasure to introduce another reader and library supporter who has joined us tonight to honor Dr. Darden and to celebrate Nashville Reads. Please join me in welcoming our mayor, Mayor David Briley.
I've asked Dr. Darden to come out with me at the beginning here. She and I have just met today, but we did have a chance to spend a little bit of time together touring the Civil Rights Room here and the Makerspace above. And we talked a lot about the book Hidden Figures. She encouraged me to do more than read the graphic novel. She thinks I'm up to it. I'm not convinced. I've read the graphic novel probably a dozen times this year in schools around town, and it is a big hit. With that in mind, I would like, on behalf of the residents of Metropolitan Nashville and Davidson County, to present a proclamation to Dr. Darden. And if you'll bear with me, the greater your stature, the longer the proclamation. So it may take me just a moment to finish this one, Dr. Darden. A proclamation honoring and welcome Dr. Christine Mann Darden. Whereas the city of Nashville endeavors to build a knowledgeable, compassionate citizenry of neighbors who understand and appreciate one another, and reading books and community conversations are key tools in that effort. And whereas Nashvillians and readers have discovered and explored the carefully researched work of nonfiction author Margot Lee Shetterly during this year's Nashville Reads Citywide Book Club initiative, and whereas Shetterly's New York Times bestseller, Hidden Figures, The American Dream, and the Untold Story of the Black Women Mathematicians Who Helped Win the Space Race, profiles 4 women of color who overcame discrimination and racial segregation to become American achievers in mathematics, scientific, and engineering history. And whereas Dr. Christine Mann Darden is one such distinguished engineer, no longer a hidden figure in our country's history. Born in North Carolina, Darden was educated at Hampton University, Virginia State University, and George Washington University with degrees in mathematics, applied mathematics, and mechanical engineering, respectively. And whereas Dr. Darden built on the groundbreaking work of NASA's first African-American female engineers, authoring more than 57 technical papers and articles, primarily in the areas of sonic boom predication, sonic boom minimization, and supersonic wing design during her 40-year career at NASA Langley Research Center. And whereas Dr. Darden has been recognized with dozens of awards and honors, including 2 NASA medals, the Black Engineer of the Year Outstanding Achievement in Government Award, and the Women in Science and Engineering Lifetime Achievement Award. She was also commended for her active involvement in working with and encouraging students to pursue careers in math and science. And whereas Hidden Figures has brought inspirational messages of perseverance, hard work, striving for excellence and equity, patriotism, and heroism to Nashville Reads participants. And we celebrate the readers and thinkers who have participated in this year's Nashville Reads initiative, featuring Hidden Figures, using their library cards, participating in book clubs, movie screenings, and events offered by the Nashville Public Library, Lipscomb University, Parnassus Books, Humanities Tennessee, Book Page, the Nashville Public Library Foundation, and the Mayor's Office of the Metropolitan Government of Nashville and Davidson County, with support from Advanced Financial Services Foundation. And whereas it is fitting and proper that the City of Nashville honor and welcome Dr. Darden in recognition and appreciation of her and the women in Hidden Figures as role models for us all. Now, therefore, be it resolved that I, David Briley, the 8th Mayor of the Metropolitan of Nashville and Davidson County, do hereby deem it an honor and a pleasure to extend our thanks and most sincere welcome to our special guest, Dr. Christine Mann Darden, signed by me this day, David Briley, Mayor of Nashville. Thank you very much, and let's welcome Dr. Darden.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Don't forget it. Thank you. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I'm just astounded about this excellent library you have here in Nashville. I had just received a partial tour and looked at some of the programs that exist here, and I think you all are awfully lucky to have such a library here. I'm a little floored about the attention I'm getting here in Nashville, but I am really pleased to be here and to talk with you a little bit and about my career at NASA. When I've talked to students around the country, I've found that they actually like to know how I got to NASA. I actually had somebody ask me a question like that one time. I was in Charlotte, and I was attending a meeting there, and as I was riding to lunch with a couple, I said, well, you know, I grew up in Monroe, which is only about 20 miles from here and so forth. And the lady turned around and said, how did anybody from Monroe ever get to NASA? I said, well, I'll tell you how I got to NASA. It was a roundabout journey. But I was born in Monroe. In fact, I was the only person in my family born in North Carolina. Everybody else came from Alabama and Georgia. And so I was sort of a tomboy growing up. One of the stories I think my mother tells about me and sort of characterized me as a child, she gave me a doll, a talking doll, when I was 5 years old. And she said, and you know, Christine, I was a little disappointed because instead of playing with that doll, you cut her open to find out why she was talking. So there, I guess that was just kind of my things I got into as a child. But I went to school in Monroe. They didn't teach a lot of mathematics in Monroe. So I think I took algebra, was the highest math class I took in Monroe. And then I was transferred to a boarding school in Nashville, a Methodist boarding school there. And the only math class that they had that I could take was plane geometry. So I took plane geometry, and whereas I had been thinking I wanted to major in biology or something like that, I absolutely fell in love with plane geometry. I enjoyed the teacher. I liked the way she taught the class. And I just did extremely well in that class. And as I thought about it, I said, I think that some of the reason that I really liked it was that it connected mathematical equations and the mathematical work with the real world. And I think that is what really excited me about mathematics. I like to know what those equations meant, and once you solve those equations, how did it impact the real world, or what were they for and everything. And so even though that was my highest level of math when I was in high school, I went off to college saying, I'm going to major in mathematics. Didn't think about the fact that I just had a really lousy background in mathematics. And so when I got there, the kids from Washington, D.C. and New York and everywhere were coming in. They'd all had calculus and analytical geometry and trigonometry. And I said, well, you know, I'll just have to start where I am and learn the rest of it. That was my attitude. And then my dad called. He said, Christine, this is 1958. He says, I'm not sure that there are that many jobs available for an African-American mathematician in 1958. And I would really like for you to be able to get a job when you get out of college. So I think you should get a teacher certificate. So I started thinking about what my dad said, and I kind of reverted to, I think I have an advancer here. I sort of reverted to this kind of little formula that I had, which I had been thinking about since I realized that I really liked mathematics. And so I'm calling that mathematics my dream career. And so P1 says, perceive of yourself in that career. And I said, okay, I had thought of myself as a mathematician. I'm this mathematician, not necessarily at NASA, but something using mathematical equations that impacted the real world and how we live. So I had done that. And then I had done P2. I'd said, what do you need to get there? Well, I didn't have to be really, really smart to say, well, what you need is a whole lot of mathematics, because I didn't have that in high school. And part 3 is work P2, work the plan that I made in P2, and how am I going to get all this mathematics? You know, I'm out of high school now. And number 4, as you heard, persist. And persistence is an extremely important quality when anybody wants to accomplish anything. You need to stick with it. You're going to run into problems. You're going to run into detours. So you need to know how to keep going, to continue trying to approach your goal. Solve those problems, find ways around those problems. Whatever it takes, you need to be able to solve that and keep approaching your goal. And so I had thought about all of this before my dad called. And I said, but you know, I know Dad was looking out for me. He was saying, I want you to be able to get a job when you finish college. And I have a lot of parents thinking about that right now, because we read in the papers every day how many students go to college and then some of them come out and have difficulty finding jobs. And so I said, I'm going to do what my dad said. I'm going to go after a teacher certificate in mathematics and physics, high school teacher certificate. But the second thing I'm going to do is I am going to take all of the electives that I earn, and I am going to take higher mathematical classes with my electives. So they wouldn't count toward my degree, but they would count toward being a mathematician. And that's what I did. And so the first, and I would say to you, I think that this formula actually caused me to make good decisions in trying to get where I wanted to go, because I had thought through this, I had thought about what I wanted to do, and it was embedded in my mind. So when I had to make a decision, I think this ran through my mind and helped me make that decision. So my second year in college there, I was taking a class called Modern Geometry, which I had to have to be a teacher. And there were 2 sections of analytical geometry taught at the same time as that class. And I needed to take analytical geometry also. But the students in my department there actually informed me that the better teacher of the 2 teaching analytical geometry, and you know students will do that, they said the better teacher is the one teaching analytical geometry at the same time as modern geometry. I think you would appreciate that teacher more. And I says, oh, well, gosh, now that introduces a problem. What am I going to do? So I said, I tell you what I'm going to do. I am not going to take modern geometry this semester. I am going to take the better teacher for analytical geometry. And so I did that. Everything went fine. And I continued taking the classes for the next 4 years. And when I got to my senior year, I forgot that I hadn't had modern geometry and that I needed it to graduate. And that year, my senior year, it was taught at the same time as advanced calculus. Well, this is certainly one of those classes that I wanted to take. I don't think I'd had any calculus. I guess I'd had a plain calculus by then. But so I wanted to take the calculus, and I had to take modern geometry to graduate. So I said, what can I do? I said, I can go to the register of the school and I can say, can I take them both? They allowed me to take them both. And so what I did is I attended the calculus class, and I got the books for the modern geometry class, but I had to read the books on my own. And the only reason I went to the geometry class was to take exams. And so that's the way I finished the year. I did well in both classes, completed both classes, and it was my senior year, and most of my electives got lumped into my senior year. So I did my student teaching in math, solid geometry, and I took 4 mathematics classes, high-level math classes. I did my student teaching the second semester in physics. Then I took 4 more math classes and finished them all. So I graduated with all my requirements to be a teacher, and I had 24 hours of electives that I had passed in higher mathematics because I wanted to be a mathematician. And I went off to teach. And as soon as I got to a job in Virginia, some of the teachers came to me and said, we go up to Virginia State College on Saturday mornings to take in-service classes. They offer them free to the teachers in Virginia. Would you like to go? And I said, absolutely, I would love to ride up there with you. So I went with them that Saturday morning and registered for another higher math class. And the head of the mathematics department was teaching that class. Everything went great that year, and I finished the class, and I enjoyed the class, and it was all well. And so about 3 years later, I had gotten married. I had moved back to the coast of Virginia, and was teaching at a school in Portsmouth, Virginia. And I was the one who went to the teachers and said, hey, Virginia State College teaches in-service classes for teachers in Virginia. You know, they're great classes. Would you all like to go up for those classes? And some of them said, well, yeah, I guess we would like to go to that. And I managed to get 1 carload of teachers to ride up to those classes. That year, they were going to be on Friday nights. And whereas I was driving 60 miles at first to get to Virginia State, Portsmouth was 80 miles from Virginia State, which meant you worked all day on Friday, you drove 80 miles to Petersburg, you sat in class for 3 hours, and then you came home about 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night. So first semester, we all did that together, and everything I thought was going really, really well. And we finished the first semester, and then everybody in the car informed me that they were going to quit they weren't going to do it the second semester. I'm saying, oh my gosh, this. I don't want to quit. I really want to take this class. I don't want to quit. And so I said, okay, I don't want to drive 80 miles by myself either, but I'm going to do it. So I continued on my own the second semester. And I must admit that many of those nights I had my head hanging halfway out the window so I wouldn't fall asleep as I was driving home at 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. And I was glad that I did do that, because about a month or two later, my husband, who had gone to Virginia State to college, got a fellowship to go to Virginia State and work on a master's degree in biology. And I'm saying, oh my gosh, it looks like we might need to move up there. So I'm going to have to look for a job around Petersburg. So I applied to all the schools around Petersburg. And I got a letter from one school asking me for a letter of recommendation. So I went to my principal and said, would you give me a letter of recommendation for this job? He said, I'd be glad to. He says, one thing though, I don't want to be looking for a good mathematics teacher in August. I'd like for you to give me your contract back. Wow, I hadn't expected that. So I says, well, you know, I'm going to be positive. I'm going to get this job. You know, that's what I'll say. So I gave him my contract back. He sent the letter of recommendation, and I never heard another word from that county, which meant I now had nothing. And so the next 2 weeks, when I went to class on Friday night, I went up to the professor and said, you know, it looks like I'm getting ready to move to this area, and I was wondering if you knew of any jobs around here I might check into. And he looked at me and he says, you're coming here and you're looking for a job? I said, yes. He says, well, let me take you across the hall and introduce you to Dr. Hodkinson, who's the head of the physics department. He's looking for a research assistant in aerosol physics. So we went across the hall and met Dr. Hodkinson, and before we left that room, I was told that I had that research assistantship. I would be supporting him in studying the light scattering of non-spherical particles, and the assistantship would pay for my getting a master's degree on my own. And so I had, by that time, taking all of the math classes I had taken, I had realized that, as I said about the geometry, I really liked the connection between what I was doing in mathematics to the real world, what I could do with anything. And after having taught school for a couple of years, I know that the students ask you, why do I have to learn this? What am I going to ever do with this? They like to know what those equations do too. And so I said, well, what I'm going to do as working on a master's is I'm going to get my master's in applied mathematics and not in pure mathematics. And so I signed up for that and went through the program in a couple of years and did my thesis on the light scattering problem. And when I was getting ready to graduate, I applied to a couple of colleges back down in Tidewater, Virginia. But then I said, well, let me go by the placement office and speak to the young lady there. So I went in and I explained that I was getting ready to graduate with a degree in applied math and I was looking for a job. She said, well, where have you been? I said, what? She says, didn't you know NASA was here yesterday recruiting? I said, no, I didn't know about it. She said, well, they were. She says, you take this application and you fill it out and you bring it back to me. I'm going to mail it in. So I filled it out and brought it back to her. She mailed it in. And 3 weeks later, I got an offer from NASA. So that was totally unexpected, totally unexpected. But I said, okay. And I told my husband, I got offers from the two colleges I applied to also. And as I told someone, each college offered $4,000. This was 1965, 67. Each one offered $4,000, and NASA offered $9,000 for the year-round job. So my husband said, well, I would take NASA. And so I made preparations to start working at NASA. And I was assigned, although I didn't know it before I got there, my position was in a computer office. And this was where the people supported the engineers who were working there. And that is exactly who the Hidden Figures book is about, those ladies who were hired there to support the engineers in their work. And I don't know how many of you had read the book. Margot put a lot of history in her book. We used to talk, get together when she would come back to Hampton, and we would talk about the work we did there, and we would talk about the book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which dealt with the migration of African Americans from the South to the North, but it had a lot of history in it. It told what the situation was in the South. It told why they went, where they went in the North, what they encountered in the North, and just lots of history. It was really, really interesting. And as Margot and I talked about it, I think she decided she was going to put more history in the book Hidden Figures. So if you read the book and you saw the movie, you see that Margot explains a lot of things in the book that are not in the movie. You just kind of sit down to watch the movie, and the people are there and everything. But the women were there at NACA because when World War I came about, the English and the French and the Russians and the Germans actually developed their airplanes far more than the United States did. The Wright brothers didn't really want their airplanes used in war. And so someone went to President Wilson and said, we need a coordinated aeronautics program in this country. And so President Wilson did appoint a 14-person committee called the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. And they were to coordinate the research for aeronautics and airplanes in this country. And they started looking for a place to build their first laboratory, and they chose Hampton, Virginia. And after they chose that site, they started building buildings there, and then they started building wind tunnels there. And they hired lots of engineers to come there and work. And so when they started running tests in all the wind tunnels, they tested the airfoil shapes. That's the cross-section of the wing. They started testing wing shapes. They started testing engines and everything. And as the data started coming in, the engineers with their slide rules were supposed to reduce this data, generate reports, and send all these reports to Boeing and send it to the military and everybody who built airplanes in the United States. And so after a while, the men got a little tired. And they said, we can't do all this work. We need some help in reducing this data and presenting reports, preparing reports. And so they decided, the NACA folks decided, we could hire female teachers who have been trained in mathematics. They could come here and do this. And so in 1935, they hired the first group of white females to come there, and they got the name computers somehow to do the calculations and work on preparing these reports and reducing the data and doing the figures and everything that had to go in the reports. And a few years later, just before World War II, they were still needing more women for all the data they were doing. And A. Philip Randolph, who was a labor leader in this country, went to President Roosevelt and said, I think you should issue an executive order, and you should say that any defense company in this country will not have any discrimination in hiring. And so President Roosevelt did issue this executive order, and that opened the door for African-American females to be hired at Langley. And so 1943, the first 5 African-American females were hired, and Dorothy Vaughan was in that class of 5. That was in 1943. And because of the laws of Virginia, that group that were hired were all segregated, and that's what was called the West Computers in the movie, The Hidden Figures. And so that's how we ended up with so many women supporting the engineers there. It was to create these reports that needed to go out all over the country and everything. And so I went there in 1967. 2 years before we walked on the moon. So I was 15 years behind Katherine Johnson and Mary Jackson. who went there in 51 and 53, and I was 25 years behind Dorothy Vaughan. So I was actually in the next generation. Katherine Johnson's daughter was my classmate, Dorothy Vaughan's son was my classmate, and Mary Jackson's niece was my classmate. So one of the things, when the movie ended and John Glenn had his come back safely into the Earth's atmosphere, and he had victory parades in lots of places. He had one in Hampton, and he rode by campus in his parade, and I was standing there, and so were these other 3 children, standing there watching John Glenn in his victory parade. And so I really wasn't at the NACA Center or the NASA Center in 1961-62 when that movie was set, because I was still in college. And I was sort of on the shoulders, as Margot wrote it in her book, of the people who had worked there for so many years before that, because they did great work. And these are the kinds of lessons we told the students as we talked about the movie. They did great work, even though they suffered some discriminations and everything. They spoke up for what they wanted. They all spoke up and said, I want to work in the wind tunnel, or I want to be a supervisor, or I want to be in that room where the decisions are made. And these are some of the things that they said. And so I'm going to stop. I'm going to back up a little bit now and kind of tell you how I got there. That was what I started out to tell you. So when I was in high school in Asheville, my job there was to bring the newspaper in on any given day. And so I remember vividly October the 4th, 1957. I was a senior in high school, and the headline, of course, was about Sputnik being shot into space. And I remember definitely all the shutters that ran through the school system in this country because the Russians had beat us to space. And so this sort of, I think we talked more about STEM then than we've been talking about now, because there was a lot of discussion for all the students to take STEM classes and to go into technical areas when this happened also. But our yearbook, we had a space theme, and it was really a big thing. And so this impacted me, although I didn't know exactly where I was going. Certainly, having done this my senior year in high school and having seen John Glenn's parade my senior year in college, that certainly gave me a lot of reason to actually kind of really want to work at NASA. So I got my job at NASA. I was assigned to the reentry physics branch. And the reentry physics branch was the branch where the engineers calculated how fast a space vehicle could come back into the atmosphere, because the speed determined the temperature that vehicle would become, how hot it would get, and if it wasn't made of the right kind of materials, it could catch a fire, burn up. So they had to be careful of that. And the angle at which it came in, if it came in at the wrong angle, it could actually bounce and go back out into space. And so they wanted to make sure neither of those happened when the vehicle was re-entering the atmosphere. They had done all those calculations for Apollo before I got there, because I got there in June of '67, and Apollo 1 had actually burned up in Florida in January of '67. So the Apollo program had begun, and they had done all of those calculations. But I worked in a lot of the wind tunnels were around there, and the wind tunnels that were in this area were for hypersonic speeds. And hypersonic speeds are speeds that, like that headline said, 18,000 miles an hour was how fast that spaceship was going. So hypersonic speeds are speeds 5 times greater than the speed of sound or more. And so we are talking, speed of sound at sea level is 700 and some miles an hour. So 5 times that would tell you what a hypersonic speed would be in that area. So that would be more like the 3,000 miles, I think. And so I worked in this area supporting the hypersonic tunnels, doing calculations for some of the hypersonic tunnels there for about 5 years. And then all of the engineers worked in offices across the hall, and they would bring equations in for us to work on and give them the answers and so forth. And I said, well, you know, I didn't know what an engineer was when I got to NASA. The engineers in Monroe, North Carolina, drove trains. The Seaboard Airlines came right through Monroe. And so when I heard the term engineer, that's what they were talking about. And so that was my concept of an engineer until I got to NASA and saw engineers sitting at desks, working through equations and doing things like that. So I really didn't realize that the theoretical engineer and the applied mathematician did pretty close to the same thing. And so I said, you know, they're bringing in equations very much like those I worked on in graduate school. I guess that's because they're engineers and I'm a mathematician. And somebody sitting with me said, well, no, several of those gentlemen have degrees in math also. I said, is that right? I said, you know, that's what I really want to do. So I went to my supervisor and I asked about the possibility of transferring to engineering. And he said, no, I don't think that's possible. I don't think you can do that. So I wasn't too pleased with that, but I sat there for a couple of weeks kind of debating what I was going to do. And I knew I could lose my job if I did anything. And finally I said, I'm going to a director and I'm going to ask about this. And so I made an appointment with the director and I went over and I said, I'd just like to talk to you for a few minutes and ask you a few questions. I said, I'd like to know why a male and a female coming here with the same background are assigned to such different jobs. Because, you know, the progress you make in a job or in an area very often depends on the kind of work you have done and been working on in that area. So I said, you know, you hire a male and he is put in an engineering section. He does research on what he's assigned to do. He gives talks on that research he's done. He writes papers on what he's done. And he gets promoted because the number of papers you wrote is what determines your promotions. And but then the women, I said, on the other hand, coming here, some with the same background, are put into the computer pool where they work for the engineer. The engineer comes in and say, solve this equation for these variables. And I said, they don't do any research. They don't give talks about what they're doing. They don't write papers. And if you saw Katherine Johnson's efforts to get her name on a paper in the movie, that was even a big job. So they didn't get promoted. And he looked at me and he says, nobody's ever asked that question before. And I think that goes back to, sometimes you've got to speak up and ask questions and everything. And I said, well, I'm asking it now. And he brought up the fact that a lot of the women, would get married to engineers that they had met out there, and they would leave the workforce. So they were training the women and giving them higher level jobs, meant they were losing money and so forth. And I kind of says, well, I don't think you'd run into that problem with a lot of the African-American women because most of them actually are supporting their families on the salaries they're making out here. And so I left and I went back to my office. But despite my fear in going there, my having planned that I'd go back to teaching if I lost my job or got fired, 2 weeks later, I got promoted and I got transferred to engineering. So it worked. And in 1972, and that's about when that was, the United States, during the 60s and the early 70s, the United States, the English and the French and the Russians were all planning to build a supersonic transport, an airplane that flies faster than the speed of sound. The Concorde, the English and the French went on and built the Concorde. You've all heard of it. It started flying in 1976. and it flew till 2004. The Russians' supersonic airplane actually went supersonic first in 1968. But it was at an air show in Paris in the early 70s, and it caught a fire. And after that accident, the Russians took the Tu-144 back to Russia. They never used it as a passenger plane. And that's what we're talking about here. Airplanes you could buy a ticket on and ride. So they used the Tu-144 as a cargo airplane after that. Except when Al Gore was vice president, he actually worked out a deal for us to rent the Tu-144 and do some supersonic experiments on that vehicle during that year. And so the United States, as far as it was preparing to do this supersonic transport, said, we're going to do some flight tests over Chicago and Oklahoma City. So they got military supersonic airplanes, and they flew them over those two cities, and they had banks of people answering phones. And the people were calling in, talking about the cracked sheetrock in their house, their cracked windows in their house, their cracked china and everything. And so there were so many calls that the United States canceled its SST program. And Boeing had actually been named as the airplane company that was going to build that SST. And I understand a lot of engineers got laid off from Boeing when they canceled that program. But not only did they cancel the SST program, they passed a law that said there would be no commercial supersonic flight over the continental United States. Now, many of you remember hearing sonic booms. Early on, we would hear the military planes flying back and forth. But after a while, we stopped hearing them. I think because there were no commercials, and most of the military planes went to the West Coast, and they would fly supersonic in test areas out over California, the desert area, and so forth. And so that law is on the books right now today. That's why you don't hear any supersonic passenger planes today, because there is a law against it. There are laws against it in Europe. There are laws against the supersonic airplanes own around the world, and that is because of the sonic boom that you hear when an airplane is going faster than the speed of sound. And so NASA decided that they were going to do some work in, can we reduce the loudness of the sonic boom so maybe we can have supersonic airplanes in this country. So when I'm talking to students, middle school students, high school students, and I want to explain what the sonic boom is, I kind of illustrate it with a balloon. As you sit in this auditorium, there's a certain air pressure on your ears. If I were to blow up a balloon, I am putting more molecules of air into the balloon. The balloon is getting bigger. The pressure in the balloon is getting higher. So if I stick a pin in the balloon and pop it, there's a shock wave set up going out in all directions at the speed of sound. And when that shock wave hits your ear, the pressure on your ear is going to jump instantaneously from where it was in this room to what it was in the balloon. And that instantaneous jump in pressure is the pop that you hear. And that can be correlated with an airplane going faster than the speed of sound. So this is a supersonic airplane, and it is generating disturbances all along the axis of the airplane here. But all of the disturbances are still traveling at the speed of sound. So you have spheres growing, going out in all directions from the center line, all kind of going up to this edge of this cone. So all the disturbances created by this airplane are contained within this cone that's on the nose of the airplane. And of course, the airplane is going faster than the disturbances are going, so you end up with the small end up here in front of the airplane. And so the pressures, there are lots of shock waves in this cone. Some of the molecules have been pushed toward the edge as the airplane goes through, but the pressure is higher inside this cone than it is outside of the cone, which is the natural atmosphere of the Earth. And so if you were standing here, this is where that cone intersects the ground. And if if that airplane is at 45,000 feet, the width of that intersection on the ground could be about 45 miles. So it could be a fairly extensive intersection on the ground. But if you're standing in the clear area, you're not inside that cone, you're actually under that cone because it hasn't intersected the ground yet. But when that airplane moves just a little bit further forward, you're going to have that intersection area pull over you and you will hear the sonic boom, or your house will hear the sonic boom, and it will vibrate, and you might get a little bit of damage. Sonic booms can be very, very loud. Sometimes it's just like a rifle crack and you don't see any damage or anything. But if the airplane is not cruising along steadily, if it is actually accelerating, then you will get shocks off of that airplane that actually coalesce with each other. And that makes the shock louder. And if the airplane is turning in a curve, that will also cause the shock waves and the waves coming from the airplane to coalesce, and you will get louder booms. And so those are known as caustics, and they can cause damage. And so there are some areas in which the work is very sensitive about, a non-steady flying airplane. But anyway, we went to work on what can we do to minimize those sonic booms. And I'm going to just quickly tell you, I was given a technical paper that had lots of equations in it where professors up at Cornell and some earlier than that were saying if you design the airplane differently and design and then go have the equivalent area of that airplane match the lower curve, that you could get a softer sonic boom. This was the equivalent area of most military airplanes that were flying at that time. The equivalent area is you calculate, if you go along the axis of the airplane and you cut it at each point like slicing a lemon and calculate the area where you cut it. That gives you the area at that point. And so that would be the area due to the volume of the airplane. The other area you need is the area due to lift. And the lift, of course, is what happens when the air flows over the wing, and the upper velocity of the air is faster because the upper surface is curved, and the pressure goes down on the upper surface. Pressure under the wing is higher than it is on top of the wing, so the resultant force on that wing is up. That is the lift of the airplane, and that's what holds it up in the atmosphere. And so we also have an equivalent area due to lift. We integrate up to the point, say of a certain point on the airplane, how much lift has been generated here. That would be the area due to lift. And we do the entire axis, and we end up with a curve of the equivalent area due to lift. Add those two curves together, and that's what we are going to try to match here. That would be the equivalent area that the theory is now telling us we would get a lower sonic boom. One of the things it really does is we get a louder shock at the beginning of the airplane, and we try to control the shocks on other parts of the airplane so they don't intersect. We don't want the shocks to intersect because they get louder. We want them to get softer as they are coming down through the atmosphere for 50,000 feet. So we actually started trying to design airplanes that would match that lower curve. And so my first design would look like that top curve, and I would have to come back and say, where do I change this design such that I can start driving the equivalent area toward the lower curve on that chart? And here is a Mach 2 design I did. It's made out of stainless steel. It's about 9 or 10 inches long, cost about $7,000. And it's costing that much because it has to be exact. All the thicknesses and dimensions on that airplane have to be exact. The Mach number on this one is about 2.7. The wings are a little bit more, lots more camber and a little bit more exotic in its design. But these two models plus a military model we put in our wind tunnel. And I was asked today by somebody what the wind tunnel was and why we use one. Well, the wind tunnel it could be a circuit around this room, like a tube or boxes and so forth, and you put a high pressure air system at one edge of that, and you blow the air through the wind tunnel around that circuit at the same speed you want that airplane to fly through the air. But now, in a wind tunnel, the airplane is sitting there and the air is going through it. But the measurements on the airplane would be the same as the airplane going through the air at that speed. And you're not going to build a full-scale airplane in the air for $7,000. So we ran tests like this, and we got what we called an N wave for the military airplane. You get a big change in pressure from what's inside that cone to what's outside in the atmosphere, and that's the noise you hear. But with the ones that we designed, we actually got a much smaller change in pressure, and we didn't get a big peak in the end. We actually got sort of a flat top. So it was going in the right direction. And we actually kept up this design work for many, many years until we decided, this theory works. And we think that as far as the design part of our program, it really, really works. We should do a flight test. And so we borrowed 2 F-5 supersonic airplanes from the Air Force. And we took one of the F-5s and put panels on the side of it so that its equivalent area matched the target equivalent area we were trying to get. And we flew those airplanes over the Mojave Desert in California. This is the F-5 that had no modification to it. That's the F-5 with the panels on it. The top airplane is an F-15 that actually had a pressure probe on the nose, and it was measuring some of these shocks coming off of these 2 airplanes at altitude. But we would measure all the way down to the ground the signals that were there. So when the data from these flights came into the control room, the shouts were just like when John Glenn came back into the atmosphere safely, because we got a big N wave from the camouflage plane. We got a much smaller shock from the plane in the middle there, which is what we were designing to do. And so we said, well, after this works, that looks like it's a great theory. What we now need, that's not a good-looking supersonic airplane up there. I call it it looks like a porpoise. So what we would want is a slender airplane for that. And so we said we need a real airplane designer to integrate the supersonic characteristics with the low boom characteristics such that we can test this out and see if it really is a good airplane and a viable airplane. Well, Lockheed Martin actually started doing some integration of those 2 things. This test was in 2002. And last year at the beginning of April, in fact, NASA awarded Lockheed Martin $247 million to build this airplane. So they're working on this airplane right now. They said it will be built by 2021. And the Mach number of this airplane would be 1.4. That means 1.4 times the speed of sound is how fast it would go. One of the things you see is that the engine is on top of this airplane. Another distinguishing feature is how long the nose is on this airplane. This airplane actually has an external vision system in the cockpit, so because the pilot can't see over the nose. But they're building this airplane. They hope to have it built in a couple of years, by 2021. And then they will carry it through all of this supersonic operations to make sure it's a good airplane there. They will carry it through the low speeds to make sure it's handled correctly. And then they will fly all over the country over people like you and let you hear the noise that it generates. And this is, instead of a loud boom or a loud crack or everything, is supposed to be more like a rumble of thunder almost, not very, very loud. So this is called it is called the low boom Supersonic X-plane. It is a NASA X-plane, and that means it's an experimental plane where they are flying it over everybody to see if this really works, as we said it would work. And the data that they collect from your responses would be taken to the FAA and ask the FAA to evaluate this data and see if the law that prohibits supersonic flight in this country could come off the books. And Boeing would build a supersonic airplane, United would buy a supersonic airplane, and you could hop on one in New York and get to Los Angeles in 3 hours. So that's the whole purpose of this program. And this is kind of what I worked on, and I've talked too long, I think, but I wanted to, if any of you have any questions you'd like to ask me about this, I guess we would have time for 1 or 2 if anybody had a burning question. Yes?
What are you proudest of when you look back on the years that you were with this organization?
I really enjoyed the work on this project. I spent a lot of years working on it, from writing computer programs to designing airplanes, to going in the wind tunnel at midnight to test airplanes, and then analyzing the data and writing reports and giving papers. And actually, I ended up leading a team that had people from Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, professors from Texas A&M and Penn State, actually working on the same team to make sure we were approaching this correctly. We also did some tests on White Sands, New Mexico, just to see what the atmosphere did to signals all the way down, looking at a calm atmosphere and a turbulent atmosphere. And we put computers in people's houses that played random sonic booms. And when they heard the sonic booms, this was people in Tidewater, they were supposed to go to their computers and give their reaction to that noise. So, and our acousticians were really working on the project. Are we really measuring that noise the way it should be measured, such that there's a correlation between the numbers we get and what the reaction of the public is? So the acousticians were actually working on that. So I think just doing the variety of work and looking at the hope that working with those mathematical equations and designing this airplane could possibly change the way we fly in this world. So I think that really excited me, and I was, just great working in that area. And so I hope I am able to see this fly, and I hope I'm able to see it successful. That's kind of what I really felt about it. So if there is there another hand? Yes, I'm sorry.
Why did you decide to build this?
Why did I decide to build it? Because, when I sit on an airplane a long, long time, my legs start hurting, and I'm ready to get up, and I want to hurry up and get. Do you ever ask your mom and daddy, are you there? Are we there yet? Have you ever asked that? Yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. Are we there yet? That's why, because that's going to go a lot faster, and you're going to get where you're going a lot faster. Does that make sense to you? Okay. Yes. I was never on a Concorde. I think there were a number of people at Langley who did have the opportunity to fly it. I was at an air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin one time, and the Concorde was there, and it was right behind where I was speaking, and boy, they cranked that thing up, and nobody could hear anything. It was so loud, really bad, but I have not been on it. Yeah. Was there another hand? Yes.
What was the trickiest equation that you ever?
What was the trickiest equation? Well, when we first were doing the test in the wind tunnel, we didn't expect such a big shock off of the engine. And so we got this huge shock. We said, where in the world is this coming from? We actually put a halt on that test and did a whole nother set of tests on just the our engine substitutes on our models, because we were wondering if the air was actually flowing through there, or was it blocked, and that's why we were getting a test. So we had to stop and figure out why we were getting such a big shock, and realize that maybe we weren't predicting that shock correctly and have to make some changes to the program, and we actually had to do that. So that was a kind of a big problem that we had. And then one time I got in trouble because when we were getting ready to do the flight test, we said we were going to try to use a missile at first. And I called out to Utah and got an 18-wheel truck with a Firebee missile and all the spare parts. And the guy from the guard at the gate called me and said, "There's an 18-wheel truck out here for you." And I said, "What do I do with it?" I said, "Oh my gosh." So anyway, we got that Firebee missile there, and we built a model of it. And we started testing it and everything, and we realized that was not going to give us the data we needed for doing that test. And we had to cancel that test. And that was that flew all over NASA like overnight. and the people out west were saying, we told them it wasn't going to work anyway. And my boss called me and said, "I want to know every phone call you had with these people. I want to know what was said when you had this phone call." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I better start writing down everything that happens." But it was a pretty big deal, and that's why we had to go to a piloted aircraft to do the test, because there were some geometric issues with the Firebee itself, and it wouldn't work. But so that was part of the trickiest kind of things that we had to do. Yes.
How excited were you when you got promoted to NASA?
When I got my job at NASA? Promoted? Well, yeah, I was very excited. You know, a promotion is always good news, and so that's something you kind of strive for, and you work hard, and you're happy when you get promoted, and I was happy.
Did you feel like an awkwardness in the two positions?
Did I do what?
Like, was there an awkwardness to it with being from one position and shifted, or?
Was there an awkwardness in being at one level?
Yeah, to the other, and then, or?
We did not necessarily always share our promotions with everybody. It was when I came along, and I think the younger generation was slightly different. People, if folks got a promotion, it really wasn't announced. And so you knew you got the promotion. You might tell your friends or something, or you might not. And so most of us did not really know the grades of the other people. Now, when some of the younger engineers came there, actually some of them would go in the secretary's office and rumble through some files sometimes to find those answers out. But that was sort of a different approach. But most of us did not know the grades of the other people, unless you knew that they was holding a certain position and you knew what position held that, what that position grade level was. Yeah. So. Another question? Yes?
Do you know about multiplication and division?
Now, I heard multiplication and division. What was the question?
Know about it.
Do I know about it? I absolutely did. And do you know, if I had not known how to multiply and divide, they would never have hired me? Absolutely. Did you know that? So I had to work hard and learn those multiplication tables and division tables. You know yours? Okay. That's great.
Are you good? You good? Are you good? Let's please, our time is up, and I just want to give you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you all for coming. Nashville has just treated me royally these last couple of days. I appreciate your being here. You've been a great audience, and I appreciate all the young people coming today, too. Thank you so very much.